What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. It's time for a combo video, the Steam Deck and the Legion Go for the first Descendant. I've put about 6 or 7 hours in this game and have been playing it a lot on the handheld, so I figured it's time to get the video out there on some performance here and what we're looking at. I'm not going to go too crazy, but I think you'll learn enough from this to see how the game's going to run and if you want to play it. Now, as far as the settings for the Steam Deck, which is where we're going to start, I am on low here. No FSR right now, but we'll talk about that later along with frame gen. You might want to up your anti-aliasing a little bit. For the purposes of this video, I'll leave it at that low preset, but just be aware of that. And then I have motion blur turned off as usual for me there. And then we're going to be 800p 1610 for our ratio there on that. Now, getting into like the first hub in Albion here, you're going to be around 30 FPS, but it's certainly going to have its times where it's going to dip down. We're very resource heavy in this game. It's not easy to run both CPU and GPU side, which is why things like FSR don't necessarily help us a whole lot in this game, which we'll go over too. And you'll see some weird jankiness in some areas where like his body or the model will go like very low frame even when the rest of the things are running well, and then it'll recover. You'll see some oddities in the game for sure. Definitely need some updates that I think will help a lot of that, but yeah, performance is going to kind of vary all over the place depending on where you're at. We do have FSR and XES and all that in here, but FSR is like FSR 1 or something. It's not great, and even on quality, when you get out in the world where there's like trees and grass and motion and stuff, it gets pretty rough. We jump up to performance here. Yeah, we see an increase in FPS right here in this spot, but a lot of other areas of the game, especially when it's busy, you don't notice much difference, but you certainly see the image quality. Now, XeSS I'm a big fan of even on the deck, but it's so CPU intensive that it doesn't really help the game, especially later when there's a lot happening, so I've kind of shied away from that as well. I kind of think that unless you're messing with some frame gen, just going native on this winds up working the best, at least for now, until we see some updates in the game. This is really just launch in early days as this thing comes out of beta. Now, getting into playing, there's all kinds of areas that you're going to run into: open world, indoor, in groups, solo, all that. And performance is certainly going to vary. And on the Steam Deck with this setup, I've been getting anywhere from 25 to 40, some 25 to 45 FPS, depending on where I'm at, depending on what's going on. And you can't really squeeze a lot more out of it. FSR will gain you a couple of FPS here and there out in the real world, but again, image quality is just going to be kind of another thing that you might have to address there. But ultimately, I mean, it's playable. I was able to play quite a couple, 2-3 hours on the Steam Deck, but it can get rough. Now, I did a public group for one of the like instances that you can go into to see how that would run. And it was pretty good, very similar to what the open world experience was like. I wanted to see, like, with a full group running around together, how it would handle that. And it's basically the same kind of performance, anywhere from 25 to 40-ish FPS, completely depending on what's going on there for that. But, like, if this is playable for you or not is completely going to be subjective, and a lot of people, I'm sure, will jump into it. Other people won't be so interested at the lower FPS, but I haven't had any major issues other than that. Now, there is frame gen that you can kick on, which uses FSR again. Have it on quality there, and you will have to manually do your GPU clock to 1600 in order to kind of stabilize it. Still a mess in my opinion on SteamOS. Frame gen just it's not been the best experience, but it is here in the game, and if you want to mess with it, it can help you out in some areas. But you will notice that it's on from image quality to latency, and yeah, it might not always gain you a lot. Here I'm running about 10 FPS to 15 FPS higher than I would be normally. Now, we also have cloud gaming, so if you happen to have a really good internet connection like I do here, and you guys know I love GeForce Now here, it runs this game fantastically. I'm full ultra 800p native here, 60 FPS locked in, and that's because the browser locks at 60 still. If we could get a native app on Linux, we could actually get up to the 90 FPS on the OLED, which would be nice. But either way, nice solid 60 FPS. Latency feels great. GeForce Now, always a good experience for me. So if that's something you like to use, you can save battery power and get a really good experience there for that. Alright, switching over to the Lenovo Legion Go, we'll take a look at this. Same settings basically with low, but I did have anti-aliasing on medium for this, and motion blur still off, and we have 1200p to start with. We'll also take a little look at 800p. I ultimately think the way you're going to run on this game here, especially at 20 watts handheld performance mode, which is what we're going to stick with throughout this video for purposes of this, I think you're going to want frame generation potentially if you're running 1200p or 800p native. But here at 1200, you can see as we were running around on the Steam Deck too, you get those weird janky times where your frame rate's all goofy, but it does tend to stabilize and work okay. And if we turn frame gen on, which with FSR quality, again, I don't love the image quality, but on the go, coming up to 1200p upscale, it's not too bad. Now back to native here in a group doing a kind of an instance. We're still in that 30s range. It runs similar to how the Steam Deck will do 800p at the 15 watts, but at 1200p 20 watts here we get kind of similar performance, so it's pretty interesting there, but that tends to happen to be the case a lot of the time. Now if we kick frame gen on though, we're able to come up here to 60 or above, which actually felt great. There's always going to be something with image quality or something with input latency, but I will say, even though I don't think this is using like the newest versions of everything, it worked pretty well. I thought the input latency was doable and that the frame rate felt really good with frame gen on the go, much better than anything I could experience over on the Steam Deck with frame gen. So that's something nice to see. I actually think I would play this game at 1200p with frame generation on, unless I run into issues with it later over the 800p native. But that's just something you can decide for yourself there. With all native in the same area here, you'll see we're at 30, 33. Which makes sense because with frame gen on, you almost doubled that. So I was in the 60s here, right? So it all depends on what you want for image quality, input latency, and your frame rate, and balance that how you want there. And of course, you can always up the wattage a bit on the go, but it doesn't help a ton in this game, I've noticed. Now, let's go ahead and go over to 800p for a minute. So same spot here, go to 800p native, and we'll be in the 40s instead of 30s standing in this spot. So of course, it's going to run a little bit easier. You're going to have areas where it's going to dip, and it's certainly not always going to stay in the higher FPS, but it does do a lot better. So if you don't want to use any FSR, but you want a little bit more bump on the FPS, but it's not as much as frame gen on 1200p, you could do this and go with 800p low native and mess around with your settings from there to dial it in. I think ultimately it looks pretty good on the smaller screen. It might not be great captured or blown up depending on how you're looking at this, but on the go screen I think it looks good. And jumping into that same instance we were at earlier with native, we were in what, 35, 37 FPS right here at 1200p native or so, and at 800p we're more in the 40s, high 40s and low 50s there, so actually pretty decent performance. You can kick on frame gen with FSR as well at 800p and get yourself well above, you know, 80, 90 FPS when it's working properly. It did break a couple of times here and I had to restart the game, and then frame gen worked again. Just be aware of that, especially at 800p for some reason. Now 800p native in a different area, back on a planet open world here, 50s, 40s, same kind of idea here. So again, in between what you would get for 1200p native and 1200p frame gen if you just wanted to go native with a little bit more experience. Then we'll jump over here to 1200p FSR quality FG on here, so about 10 FPS more, 5 FPS more running it this way, but I think the image quality looks pretty darn good here on the go, and I don't know, I just kind of prefer it this way, at least so far for me. And then we'll jump back over to the 800p native here. So it's kind of good that between wattage, resolution, and your settings and everything, there's definitely room to play here between the 30 FPS and 60 or higher, depending on what you're wanting to get, battery drainage, all that kind of stuff. But there's definitely a little wiggle room. Unlike on the Steam Deck, we're kind of locked into just running it the best we can and as low as we can. You do have some option here to play the game that you want to, the way that you want to, on the go, at least anyway. So that's going to be different for everybody, but I think this gave you a general idea of how it's running and what you might be able to get out of the game on either platform. Alright guys, thanks a lot for coming to check out the video as always. I really appreciate it, and I'll see you in the next one.